Welcome to History 134. We're on the Napoleonic era, and I hope I don't go over on my presentations for the class, but that's probably going to happen. I have more than 450 books in my library on Napoleon. I spent a lot of time working on my master's degree along those lines. But before we get started with the actual presentation, I thought I'd show you something that's odd. Amongst my books, I have small books, medium-sized, and giants. This is the smallest book that I have on Napoleon. It's called The Life of Napoleon Bonaparte in 44 pages. And you go, 44 pages? What is the deal there? There is a gentleman who used to live in Girard, Kansas, who believed that people would be educated if the books were smaller. So he made a whole series, over 200 of these little booklets, on everything from Shakespeare's plays in 44 pages to biographies. So this is one of the smallest books that I own. One of the oldest books on the Napoleonic era is this 2-volume set, which was done in 1829. But this is its second edition. The first edition was done in 1819, just a few years after the Napoleonic era was over. And in a print that is pretty much microscopic. If you're going to read that today, you're going to need to have a magnifying glass. And then this monster book that you see, Frederick Mason's Josephine. Now, Frederick Mason is the world expert on Napoleon in 1900, and he wrote a whole series of books in these, what they refer to as tome, giant size. And they're all inscribed, and they all have, it's all in parchment. And they have these beautiful prints. This thing is covered with prints. This is the one that's the front piece on Josephine. They came actually unbound. You were supposed to go to a special bookstore to get the binding. And then when I bought them, they were still in paper, and then I had them bound. But this one is one of only 1,500 of this version. I have one on Napoleon's son, of which they only made 500. And then I have one on Marie Louise, his second wife, of which there's only 900. But it's, as you can see, it's a little hard to be able to read this. But at any rate, I'll be talking some more about some of the other books later on. So I hope you enjoy this presentation.
For the study of the Napoleonic Wars, David Chandler is your author. Campaigns of Napoleon, Dictionary of Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon's Marshal. What I like to say, Chandler Library of Napoleonic History. From a biography standpoint, find Emile Ludwig, which is a book written in the 20s, which is still okay, but I particularly like Napoleon Bonaparte, The Intimate Biography by Vincent Cronin. Much more sensitive, much more balanced. The problem you have, as I said before, with Napoleon is if you're not French, everybody else hates him. So it's hard to get a good balanced view. Then here's two odd ones. Felix Markham's Napoleon, which is very, very short, less than 100 pages. And then there's Napoleon, the Bisexual Emperor by Dr. Richardson. So there's some odd stuff out there. So there's plenty to look for. You just have to be careful. It's time to bring Napoleon onto the scene. The French Revolution was confusing enough. Trying to keep track of Napoleon at the same time is pretty difficult. So let's backtrack a little bit. Let's go to the island of Corsica. That's where Napoleon was born on August the 15th, 1796. Now, Corsica had been part of France, had been added in the early 1700s. His mother and father, Carlo Bonaparte. His mother was Letizia Ramolino. Napoleon's father was a minor nobleman. He died while Napoleon was in military school of stomach cancer, a problem that kind of haunted the Bonaparte family. Napoleon, at the age of 9, went off to Brienne, which is the military school for artillery. This is like going to West Point. During his years at Brienne, They always talk about how he was a loner. Remember, this is pre-revolution, so you can't get into the school unless you're a noble. So he's in with nobles from all over France who speak perfect French, and he's speaking Italianized French. So it's going to be a little bit of a problem for him. Ultimately graduated kind of in the middle of his class. You'll see his graduation there. He's lieutenant of the artillery in 1783. People will say, what was so special about Napoleon? He didn't graduate first of his class. Remember, he's 14 years old when he graduates from the military academy. Most of the people are graduating at the age of 19, 20, and 21. He was a brilliant mathematician, and you needed math to use the Gabriel system of artillery use in the French military. Now you notice that he is lieutenant of the artillery. You hear the term, he's a little corporal. He was never a corporal. Lieutenant is the lowest rank he ever held. The term little corporal is a nickname given to him by the Army of Italy in honor of the way he acted in combat. So we'll get to that in a little bit. Ultimately, when the revolution breaks out, he's part of the regular army. Napoleon comes to the attention of the Republic at the Siege of Toulon. It's an excellent book on the Siege of Toulon. Toulon is the French main naval base, but the people of Toulon asked the British Navy to take them over because they didn't support the revolution. So they've been trying to take it back for quite some time. And the problem that you have, it's 1793, so you're in the middle of the Reign of Terror. Generals became very conservative after General Dumouriez switched sides and went to the Austrians. And so every general and every army has representatives from the Committee of Public Safety. So you get conservative. Napoleon came up with an idea. He realized that Toulon's situation is very similar to Boston in the American colonies. George Washington moved cannons from Ticonderoga down to the Heights in Boston so that they overlooked the British Navy. They could fire on them, but the British couldn't respond, which forced the British to leave the harbor. It's exactly what Napoleon wanted to do. So in this chart you can see where the placements are. He got permission from the general to move the artillery to do assaults on various areas to get the main position, and then started bombing away at the British Navy, ultimately forcing them to retreat. And then this led to him being allowed to lead the assault and capture of the city. It's the only major victory in France during 1793. So yes, the Committee of Public Safety was very appreciative, brought him to Paris, promoted Chief of Battalion in October 16, 1793, and then General of Brigade in February the 6th of 1794 in honor of his service at Toulon. Napoleon's career looked bright in early 1794, but then he gets sent to prison. The problem is he was a Danton supporter, which meant that when Danton was executed, he became subject to arrest, and he ends up going to prison. He wrote a letter to his family saying that he thought that this was going to be the end. But fortunately, in August of 1794, the death of Robespierre set him free, and he is needed. The Directory government that comes into power isn't very popular, and there's a concern there's going to be an attempt to overthrow the government. And Napoleon is literally the only general available. What the Directory didn't know was that everybody knew that. He had actually been approached by the people who were going to revolt against the Directory. And so he knew their plans and everything, and ultimately the Directory appeared to be a better choice for him at this point. So he decided to support the government. They moved in artillery, they brought in troops from various areas, they put the cannons in important locations in the city, and when the people rioted, he of course knew when that was going to take place and where it was going to take place. He fired cannons full of grape shot. That's why it's known as the whiff of grape. Ultimately, his forces are successful, and then he is going to have to be rewarded again. I like this quote from Napoleon. The best medicine against the grapes of wrath is a whiff of grape shot. But now Napoleon is in an odd situation. He, by being successful in defending the Directory, becomes a threat to the Directory. So you'll notice his promotions. General Division in October the 5th, 1795. That's the day of the whiff of grape. Then he's made Chief of the Army of the Interior, which means he controls the forces of the French army around the city of Paris. At that point, they decide they need to get rid of him. So they make him General of the Army of Italy, an army that hardly has shoes and is hardly uniformed. What is supposed to happen is he's supposed to go there and become a forgotten general, thus protecting the Directory. During the period that Napoleon is General of the Army of the Interior, he meets Josephine, who will ultimately become his first wife. Josephine was first married to Alexander Beauharnais, who was a noble. She was from Martinique. They'd gotten together. Unfortunately, they were captured during the Revolution and sentenced to be executed. And her husband was executed. But Josephine just lingered in prison, probably because she was saved by a gentleman in the office of execution. When they sentenced you to execution, they had to write up an execution notice. That had to be written then in triplicate so everybody could get the right piece of paper. If you lose the original, you just sit in prison. And there's a gentleman in the office who ate them. He would just pull pieces of one off until it was eaten. It's made out of parchment, so it's kind of like roughage. And that's an explanation for why she survived. There are about 100 people that may have been saved by him. But ultimately, after she's released from prison, she becomes the mistress of the head director, Paul Barret. And then here is a cartoon showing Napoleon peeking around, seeing Josephine and her friends dancing naked in front of the big bloated Barret. He falls madly in love with her. They date a little while. She really wasn't looking for a marriage. She was just looking to get a new sugar daddy because she was spending a lot of money and Barret was trying to get rid of her. And so he kind of pawns her off on Napoleon. Ultimately, they are married. Just a civil ceremony. You go in and sign some documents. The gentleman sitting in the chair, who's the official, made a comment to her, "Why are you marrying this general? He will disappear shortly." Well, obviously that didn't happen. When Napoleon and Josephine are crowned empress and emperor, Napoleon has his secret police find this man, and they set him in the front of Notre Dame. And as they were leaving, Napoleon walked over to him and said, "Monsieur, the last time we met, I believe you were mistaken about the direction my career was going." And away they go. Well, Josephine goes out and buys Malmaison, her beautiful little chateau in the area. Terrible name, the bad house or the sick house. But here is the furnishings that were ultimately put in it. You have Napoleon's bedroom, and the bed is done in campaign style. Then we have a sitting room or the council room. Notice the chairs have swans on them. That was her emblem. French royalty, the king and the queen took animals. Napoleon was an eagle, she was a swan. And so they had the chairs done like this in this consulate style. And then here's Josephine's bedroom, which is just stunning. And it is round and it has a tent-like structure on the top of it. And they have a painting on the ceiling, which looks like you're looking up into the sky. And there's Napoleon's study. And then there's Josephine's garden. Josephine was a rabid rose collector, and Napoleon was constantly bringing roses back from all over Europe that they found interesting during his conquests. And so this is where Napoleon and Josephine lived for a time, well, at least until he becomes emperor. Napoleon now sets off to join the army of Italy. He's one of the youngest generals of an army in all of France, and he arrives to find quite a mess. Soldiers without shoes, clothes tattered. It's an army in name only. And there's some grumbling amongst the group. But after a while, he comes up with his plan, and he meets in front of the soldiers and tells them, he said, "Where's our new campaign plan? We're going to attack some of these towns, but the main reason we're going to attack them is not just to defeat the Austrians, but to get you shoes, to get you equipment, to get you uniforms." This inspired the troops, and they fought very well for him. And during this campaign, it's not unusual to see Napoleon riding amongst the troops during combat. And this is where he gets his nickname, the Little Corporal, because most of the generals sat back on their horse or stood with their telescope and watched the battle and then took the credit when it was over. And here is his actual uniform. Now, he's 5 feet 7 inches tall, but he is really skinny. As a matter of fact, when he came back from the Italian campaigns, local people began to give him a new nickname. They called him Puss in Boots because he was so skinny inside of his outfit. And then here is a picture by Jacques-Louis David of Napoleon crossing the Alps. One of the things that the Italian campaign does, Napoleon created a new type of military system. It's called the central position. In Italy, Napoleon was constantly being harassed by multiple Austrian armies. He would move in to engage larger forces, screen one group of them, while using the rest of his troops to deal with a weaker one. After finishing that one off, he would then move back, then with his superior numbers take out the second one. The trick to this is you have to have good commanders that can be where they're supposed to be in a certain amount of time. This is time sensitive. If you take too long and you can't get back, then the weaker force is subject to being pretty much destroyed. You see this in the campaigns in the American Civil War with Robert E. Lee, particularly in Northern Virginia, where they would use the railroads. He could use his one part of the Army of Northern Virginia. He could give Stonewall Jackson another part. He could give another part to Longstreet. They could be in 3 different areas. But when necessary, they could be entrained, put on trains and moved in instead of having to march in. At the Battle of Antietam, Jackson's men marched from Harper's Ferry to Antietam to help save the day. And you have to find those commanders. And it takes the early part or the whole part of the first Italian campaign for Napoleon to find those people. Then we see another example of his fighting spirit. This is the Battle of Arcola, where his army has to get to the other side of the river and cross this bridge. And they've tried and they've tried and they've tried, and he grabs the flag and runs across the bridge under fire, kind of taunts the men, and they all run over towards him. So there's this real camaraderie that he builds amongst the army of Italy. This is the kind of camaraderie that he is really excellent at creating. Even when you get towards the end of his career, his opponents will say Napoleon at the battlefield is worth 20 to 40,000 men. So you tried to fight battles against the French army where he wasn't present. And here's the military campaigns. You see the Italian campaign against the Austrians. The Italian campaigns are always against the Austrians. And you see that he defeats them, and he dictates the Treaty of Campio Formio. He doesn't send it to the Directory for them to decide what to do with it. He dictated it. And then, of course, the other thing that you have is he has to save the government again. There's an attempt to overthrow the government, this time by monarchists. He has to send the army in to protect them one more time. The Directory is now in real trouble. They sent Napoleon to Italy to disappear. Now he's come back stronger than ever and a bigger threat than ever to take over the government. 1798, Napoleon comes up with the idea of invading Egypt, the idea of marching towards India to damage British shipping and business. It's kind of a harebrained idea, particularly since the French Navy is not exactly great at this time, but the Directory's in for it because, hey, here, he's going to Egypt, maybe we'll finally get rid of him. So he will embark on the Egyptian campaign, which is great for us today because of the 500 savants that he took with him. He took scientists and mathematicians and all sorts of people. And of course, it is this expedition that discovers the famous Rosetta Stone. In the campaign, he is actually in Egypt and into Syria. He actually fights a battle at Mount Tabor in Palestine. So we have the Battle of the Pyramids, be our first battle, the Battle of the Nile, and the naval battle, and the Battle of Abu Qir Bay. One of the best books on the topic is this Al-Jabardi's Chronicle of Napoleon in Egypt. It's an eyewitness account. As a matter of fact, there's an assignment that I give out of this book.
Something I wanted to show you. I've talked about artifacts, and this is a little unique. You can see this letter sitting over here to my side here. You had a homework assignment where you read from a gentleman who was an eyewitness account to Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. And he talked about documents. He was talking about what they were asking Napoleon to do. After that document was printed and written, he went to another town, Rosetta. And this is the actual document from his meeting at Rosetta. The same thing happened. The sheikhs of the area came and asked him, they have some laws that they hated, and those are in Arabic on one side. They were then translated into French on the other side. Then they were presented to Napoleon, who signed them. It's signed down here saying we're going to get rid of all of these. Now this is an interesting signature, and I will show you close-ups of it as we go along. But Napoleon is called the King of the Blots. You see how his signature is got the big swirl on the back. At any rate, this area right here, he puts so much ink on the quill that before he finishes, he's frequently, what they usually do is put sand over it and then rub on it, hold it, and it kind of blots it. He always gets his hand on it, kind of blurs it a little bit. So this is an actual document signed by Napoleon, that happens after your homework assignment. And I have this translated, so perhaps maybe I can torture another class with it later on. So it's time to move on.
In my Western Civ class, which I hope they have completed. But here he comes in. He lands in Alexandria after dodging the British Navy, who's on the lookout for him. They take over Alexandria, and then they begin maneuvering. One group will go up towards Rosetta and then come down the Nile. The other group will go overland, and they'll meet up and then head on down to Cairo. And Napoleon, along the way, meets up with various sheikhs in the region. Now, Egypt is controlled by the Ottoman Empire, and they use Mamelukes, which are actually slaves, to run the government. He gets a very good reception from the local people. And of course, his troops, while rebuilding some of the fortifications, find our friend the Rosetta Stone, which is a very, very large rock. This was put in place by one of the Ptolemies during the successor period after Alexander the Great's time period. And it has all three languages that were being used in Egypt. It has the Egyptian hieroglyphics at the top, the demonic, almost like Coptic writing in the middle, and then you have the old classical Greek at the bottom. And ultimately, it will be deciphered by Jean-Francois Champollion. Here is the original Rosetta Stone, because Napoleon will be successful for a while in Egypt, but ultimately the British will defeat the French. So the British end up with it, and they are the ones who get to take it home. And this is a picture of the Rosetta Stone in the British Museum. The one side with the writing, and that's what it looks like on the back side. It's not easy to get these pictures. You'll notice that I'm standing as close as I could get where you could see me and the stone, but this is what it was. The one picture off to the other side is what it was like most of the time. It's the first thing you see when you go into the museum, so it's crowded all the time. So if you want to take good pictures of it, you have to wait till later. That's when I got the pictures that we have here. Once they've gone out of Rosetta, they then head south, and they then end up near Cairo. We call the Battle of the Pyramids, but you might have been able to see them in the distance. They weren't fought directly underneath. And of course, the Egyptian army is Mameluke cavalry. And so the French are not going to engage them in their normal position. They're going to build squares. Here's some examples of the Mameluke cavalry, which Napoleon believed was one of the finest in Europe. And he also thought that of the Cossacks as well in 1812. But he liked these people so much that after he left Egypt, he had 2 regiments of Mamelukes in the Imperial Guard cavalry. And here's a picture of one of the famous paintings of the Battle of the Nile, and you can see the cannons in front of the squares overlapping each other with a big gap so that when the Mamelukes charge through, they can be shot from both sides. Yes, this painting probably is a little more accurate as to how close they were to the pyramid. But we have other artists who have decided to put it right at the base of the pyramid. And then once that's over, they control Egypt. They begin measuring everything. There's Napoleon at the Sphinx. And then here's Sherry and I at the Sphinx. Its nose was broken long before Napoleon showed up. It fell off in an earthquake. It was not used for target practice. He spent the night inside the pyramid. The next morning he said, I don't want to ever talk about. So it was a little shaky. And then he goes north to Alexandria. And unfortunately, Admiral Nelson and the British Navy have caught up with the French. And they have the Sea Battle of the Nile. And you see on this chart that the French Navy, under Villeneuve and one of the other commanders, have formed a line. They can't get out to maneuver, so they're going to form a line. And the normal procedure for fighting at this time would simply be to run along the line of other Navy ships firing at one another. Nelson's going to change that. Nelson is going to come up with tactics to cross through those lines, what they call crossing the T. It's hazardous. So, for example, there's a nice picture. There's the famous portrait of Nelson. So here's a painting that shows the ships in line formation. And here you have the British ships turning, and they're going to head through those lines. And when they break through, so your broadsides are going through the back and the front, just tearing them apart. The problem with going through a line is you can be cut off and surrounded by multiple ships. Of course, you have the L'Orient, which is one of the largest ships in the world at the time, the French flagship, and it blows up. Only 3 ships managed to escape from the French, and basically that means that Napoleon's army is now stuck in Egypt. Here's a couple of English cartoons. There's the one cartoon where the British are gobbling up the French fleet, and then there's the other one where Lord Nelson or Admiral Nelson is pounding away at the crocodiles, which are the French, with his club. You notice he's missing an arm. He lost the cannonball, took it off just below the shoulder in one of his previous battles. And this is the display in England with the last surviving flag from the HMS Victory. from this time period and one of his uniform. It's a disaster for the French. And at this point, Napoleon is concerned because if the news gets back of this massive defeat and he has to surrender, this will hurt his chances of overthrowing the Directory. Ultimately, Napoleon decides that he needs to leave the army in Egypt and go back to France. But in order to do that, he needs to fight one more land battle, which is the Battle of Aboukir Bay, or the Battle of Aboukir, where he defeats the Turkish army again, driving him into the sea. What will take place next is in 1799, he will then give command of the Egyptian expedition to General Kléber. And then he will get on a ship, a single ship, and manage to get through the blockade and get back to France. Unfortunately for General Kléber, he's assassinated by a Mameluke, and ultimately the French will have to surrender. But that surrender will not take place until after Napoleon is back and in charge. So that's a plus. Napoleon returns on October the 9th, 1799, and is treated to a hero's welcome because they only have the dispatches from when he was winning, not losing the fleet at the Battle of the Nile. But here's the situation of the territory in 1799. There is a lot of discussion amongst people what should happen to the Directory. Abbé Sieyès and others have decided that Napoleon is the man that they want to change the government. Now, Napoleon has a compatriot who could do the same thing. Sieyès and a gentleman named Roger Ducos were looking for someone who was a military man, but also a son of the Revolution. Napoleon was the obvious choice, but there was also another one, and that was Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, who just happened to be married to Napoleon's old girlfriend, Désirée Clary. At any rate, the planning to overthrow the government took place in such a way that Désirée was able to keep Jean-Baptiste out of Paris long enough for it to take place. Now, Lucien was a member of the Assembly, and the idea was Napoleon would simply go into the assembly, tell the people that he was going to take over, they would be all prearranged. Nothing would change. He would just change the government. Well, the painting that you see here shows that didn't go very well. He actually got physically challenged and kind of jostled around a little bit. He's with the military, but not with the politicians. And when it didn't go really well, he just simply called in his Grenadier Guards and they cleared the place out. And so this is known as the coup d'etat of 18 Brumaire, and it will bring in the consulate. Here is the official proclamation that was placed around the country and in newspapers, telling everybody what had taken place and that the Directory had been overthrown. It was a bloodless coup. Now, initially, there is a provisional group of 3 consuls. The provisional group was Abbé Sieyès, who I like to call the Thomas Jefferson of the French Revolution, Roger Ducos, and Napoleon Bonaparte. Well, they thought the 2 of them could kind of control the military side of Napoleon. They were wrong. Ultimately, they will be convinced to retire, and their place is filled by 2 men. One of them is an ex-Jacobin, Chambrasis, and the other one is a crypto-royalist named Lebrun. So he brings a royalist faction in and a Jacobin faction in, even though they have no power whatsoever. Ultimately, a plebiscite approves the new arrangement by a large majority, and on December the 14th, the Constitution of the year 8 came into force. By that time, Napoleon was already recognized as the de facto first consul. And then in 1802, he was made consul for life. And in early August, a plebiscite again was held and revealed that 3.5 million votes in favor with only 8,000 against. So he was very popular. And one of the things that happens under the consulate is this is when all of the revolution is finally organized, settled, straightened out, and the government and the country begin to work again. Let's look at the government of the consulate. As you can see, there's the new constitutional vote, 3,011,007 in favor, 1,562 against. That was universal male suffrage. But you're voting for notable. You're not voting directly. So it's like you're voting for an elector. And so people were selected to be notable. So there's a little bit of government control there. Now, the legislative body could only reject or pass laws. So when laws came down, that was all they could do. They didn't debate it. They just said, well, that's a good law, we'll pass it. That's a bad law, we'll reject it. Tribunate was created. Now, they were responsible for discussing and deliberating on legislation, but they couldn't vote on it. They couldn't act on it. So you have one group of people who debate it and discuss it, and then one group of people who votes on it. Then we had a Senate. The Senate was appointed, and they're referred to as notables. And the Senate proposed legislation. So you have a Senate, a tribunate, and a legislature. Proposes, discusses, and then votes. And then there are three consuls, with the first consul making the decisions and running the state. This is not like the Roman consul system where you had equal sharing of executive power. In Rome, they only had two consuls, one for the plebeians and one for the patricians, and that balanced everything out. Basically, what we have here is one strong leader and two people who are there for ceremonial purposes, let's say. But this is a step away from the committees running it and a step closer to an individual running it, but certainly isn't a king. He has these other structures that come in here. And Napoleon spent a lot of time bringing in qualified people to recommend what needed to be done. So good legislation is going to come out of this. You know, if you remember, the revolution passed so many laws at certain points that they had to send out a monthly bulletin to tell you which laws should be enforced before the others. And then here's Napoleon's consular outfit. It's a painting, of course, by Jacques-Louis David. He is the painter of the revolution and Napoleon, just like Abbe Sieyès is the constitutional writer. There's the painting, and there's how it survives, the original. It's kind of faded a little bit. And as first consul, he had his own first consul saddle. Here is Europe in 1799. It's not going to be completely peaceful. The Austrians are going to be stirred up again, and you'll see the consulate military campaigns. In June of 1800, the Battle of Marengo. And that victory sends the Austrians to the peace table once again. You might ask, where is Austria getting all their money? They're being provided money by the British, who want to keep Napoleon under control. And then you see there's ultimately a peace made with Great Britain in 1802, a nice little thawing. But let me mention something about Marengo. Here's the famous painting of the Battle of Marengo. At this time, Napoleon has now gone into a phase where he's trying to maneuver his opponent into one winner-take-all battle. Part of the reason for this is the French economy, which is now coming back to life, cannot withstand the financial burden of long military campaigns. So the shorter the campaign, the better it is for the economy. So he lures the Austrians into this combat, and it really goes back and forth, beginning to fade. Napoleon's troops are beginning to retreat, but he knows he has another corps of troops on the way, and General Desaix arrives at the last minute and saves the battle. Unfortunately for Desaix, he's killed during the fighting, but some people say, well, Desaix should have gotten all of the credit for it. As Napoleon said, you know, there's one unit of troops that every good general knows how to command, and that is luck. And he was lucky, and it worked out for him. But it settled everything for 4 years. And then here's Europe in 1800, and there's 1801, and then there is 1802. And you can see the Marengo campaign as it changes.
Welcome to the consulate. A couple little items I wanted to show you. You remember from the French Revolution, when I showed you the coins, they were all copper. Well, Napoleon has worked on the Bank of France, and the economy has changed, and so we now have silver and gold coins. This is a 20 franc gold piece. They made a 40 one as well. So gold coins are now circulating in the French countryside. The coins, they're made out of silver. This is a 5 franc coin with Napoleon on one side, and it has the same emblems on the back of the Revolution. Ultimately, they will add Napoleon's family coat of arms. But they also made this in 1 franc out of silver and half a franc, 50 centimes. So now instead of having copper coinage in terrible paper, and by the way, Napoleon burned the assignats in a gigantic bonfire in the middle of Paris. Now that we have actual coins with actual value. So this is one of the most important things that Napoleon did. He settled the revolution and was able to put the economy back in place. Then there's one other thing. This is a document from the consulate period, and it's a standard document. They print these up. They have blanks on them. And what these are is a new mayor is put into place, somebody is given a job in the government, and they then fill it in with their name, when it was entitled, and then it's signed. Now this is something that it's very difficult to see, but I'll have close-ups of it so that you can look at it. It is signed by the Secretary of State, several other people, and it is also signed by Napoleon. In the middle it says Bonaparte, but that's not his signature. The Secretary of State was empowered to sign his name on these types of documents. And so what he does is he signs it in a diagonal and then signs it as Bonaparte. And so it's easy to pick out. If you're a collector of Napoleonic letters or you're just starting, you want to be careful because that's not really his signature. The one problem with these documents is they are on parchment, but they're waxed. So it is really hard for the ink, even black Indian ink, which normally just lasts forever, to stay there. So these have kind of faded a little bit, and I have to keep them in a desk drawer to keep them from getting any worse. But this gentleman was, it says in the name of the people of France, Bonaparte, first consul of the Republic of France, and they've granted him a mayorship in a town. So that's our document for the consulate. You've seen a document already for the Egyptian expedition. Your next artifacts, you'll have to wait till we see Napoleon on St. Helena. So back to the show.
Let's see how France stabilizes during the consulate period. Here we are in 1800, at peace. At peace for 3 or 4 years. There's internal order that is now assured, so you don't have to worry about being robbed on the highways. Peasants are no longer terrorized. General amnesty is offered emigres. Napoleon said, if you want to come back, you can. We're not going to give you your land back, and you won't have any privileges, but you can come back and feel safe. The only people being executed are, for the most part, criminals. Able and reasonable men enter the government and the military. I mentioned this before, in the French military, and it's one of their big advantages besides leadership, that if you are a good soldier, there's no limit to how high you can rise. You can become marshal. That's how fluid it is. So the men are always well led. There's a gentleman whose heart is buried at the Invalides, and he was a sergeant who turned down promotion over and over and over again because he said that you needed to have good people to train the young recruits. And when he passed away, the government asked if they could have his heart and honor him. So we're having good people running the government. Now there's reconciliation with the church. This is a very important move by Napoleon, the Concordat with the Vatican in 1801. So the Pope now had the right to look at all the bishops that had been put in place during the Revolution, and he could depose any of them that he wanted. Napoleon recognized that the Pope was over the church, but not the state. So seminaries were reopened so that priests could be made. The Pope then in return recognized the Republic, but church land was not returned. Now this business of recognition is really important. Remember, what's happening here is the Pope is recognizing Napoleon as the legitimate leader of France, who is the representative of the French Revolution, which overthrew the king. This is why you don't have diplomats from foreign countries going to Napoleon's coronation or any other major event, because they don't recognize him, because then it would mean that they recognize the revolution, their legitimate reason for removing the king, which would make them and their kings in peril. Then we go on then, public authority in the hands of paid government agents. Authority of the government fell equally on everybody. Neither civilian nor military commissions could be bought. No matter how much money you had, you couldn't buy a captaincy, you couldn't buy something else. Citizens rose in the government and in the military, again based on talent. No tax exemptions. Taxes were collected for the first time in 10 years. Now I'm sure that wasn't a positive thing for a lot of people. They didn't collect 10 years worth of taxes, but they actually collected taxes. Accounting methods are introduced. The money is made sound. I will show you Napoleonic coins here later on. He established the Bank of France. This is one of the best economic moves made during the period, because now the currency is under control. They keep track of how much gold they have. They make the coins worth what they say. Is excellent. And then what most people learn about, frequently the only thing they learn about, is the codification of French law, called the Code Napoleon. A civil code, a penal code and commercial code. So all the laws were looked at, removed bad ones, organized, reorganized what they needed to do, and made them plain and understandable. One of the things that happens is all of these laws about equality and everything else go with the French army. When a territory is taken over and becomes part of France or becomes an ally of France, or they're run by one of Napoleon's relatives, the Code Napoleon is brought in. And if you're a noble, you're now equal with everybody else. And it's one of the longest lasting parts of the Napoleonic era. The removal of this in Europe after Napoleon is defeated and removed in 1815 ultimately leads to the 1848 revolutions, where the people want some of those rights back. And then here is a copy of the civil code of the Code Napoleon. And that completes part 1. We'll be picking up here with the Emperor and taking him all the way to 1815 next time.